This is the Jackson Neill Sports Podcast. Welcome back here to the podcast on Friday, September 20th, 2019. Glad to be back here on a Friday. Looking forward to the weekend and tomorrow. Huge day in college football. The marquee game, Notre Dame versus Georgia. I want to talk about Notre Dame and really just how important this game is for their program. But before I jump into that, I want to remind everyone that this podcast is available on all of your favorite platforms, and you can subscribe and rate it on your favorite platforms. That includes Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, as well as my website, jacksonneillpodcasts.com. So wherever you like to get podcasts, make sure to rate and subscribe there to keep up with all of the latest episodes. So this Saturday, and this weekend in general, because there are some games tonight, is a really big college football weekend. And, every once in a while, earlier in the season, we're starting to see conference play get started in some instances, but also some big non-conference games. And it's kind of hit or miss in these first, 5 weeks or so of the college football season. The first 2 weeks, there were definitely some marquee games there. Last weekend, no two ranked teams took on each other, although Iowa State, kind of a ranked-on-ranked matchup. Syracuse-Clemson, if Syracuse hadn't gotten blown out by Maryland, that would have been a ranked-on-ranked matchup. So there were a couple solid games there. Both of those, the Iowa State, but due to weather delays, just was difficult to watch and difficult to kind of follow up with. And then you saw the Clemson game. They completely blew out Syracuse. I don't think too many people were surprised by that outcome after Syracuse got demolished by Maryland. But there were still some good games. Temple beat Maryland. That was a competitive game. You looked at, Penn State barely got by Pittsburgh. That Arizona State, Michigan State finish, that was awesome. So there were still some good games here or there. But last weekend was kind of all thought of to be looking forward to this Saturday, because this Saturday features several games with ranked teams taking on one another, including a big top 10 matchup when number 7 Notre Dame heads to number 3 Georgia. That's a Saturday night. That's the Saturday night game for this weekend. And a huge one in terms of the college football playoff, this season in general, for both of these teams. Just an enormous non-conference game for both schools. If you remember back in 2017, Notre Dame lost 20-19 to Georgia. The Bulldogs just squeaked out that 1-point win in South Bend, one of the best games of the 2017 season. So obviously, there's some kind of high expectations for this game. But looking at this game and looking at this matchup, it becomes clear that while it's a really big game for both of these programs, it doesn't take too much research to say that this is obviously a lot bigger of a deal for Notre Dame. You look at the rest of their schedule; they still have a couple games left there against some currently ranked teams. They go against Virginia next week. That's a home game, and they have to go at the end of October at Michigan. But depending on how Michigan, does against Wisconsin and how they've played against other teams like Army, to think that they could possibly not even be ranked in a month, that would not be out of the question. I expect them to be a top 25 team, but really, if you've seen them play so far this season, I would say nothing would surprise you. So this is the biggest game for Notre Dame on their schedule, whereas for a team like Georgia, they're in the SEC. There are so many big games for them going on. All the conference play. If they're able to get through the SEC East, they're going to play presumably Alabama, maybe LSU. Upsets Bama and they get to the SEC championship game. But for Georgia, even if they lose this game at home, there's still going to be tons of opportunities for them to make it up. For them to basically say, okay, look, we lost this non-conference game, but it was against a top 10 team. Look, these other resume-defining wins. It will make the room for error for them less, but still definitely more important for Notre Dame. A loss this weekend eliminates them from the college football playoff consideration. So as I took a look at this game and as I thought about the overall just implications involved for Notre Dame, I kind of looked back at this past decade for Notre Dame football, because it's kind of hard to imagine, but if you go back to 2010, Brian Kelly's first season, Notre Dame was really just kind of a program in transition. They're historically one of the best programs of all time. I don't really need to go over how many championships they've won in their history. But before Brian Kelly took over in 2010, the Fighting Irish kind of went through this really, really bad, bad stretch for their program. In a 17-year stretch dating back to about 1993, they only had 2 10-win seasons. Went through a couple head coaches in that time, including people like Charlie Weiss, and they just didn't really accomplish all that much. For a program where you expect national championships, 2 10-win seasons in 17 years is not good enough. So they bring in Brian Kelly, who had all the success at Cincinnati, and they thought, okay, maybe this guy's the answer. And since then, there's been this narrative that Notre Dame is quote-unquote back. They're back into the national conversation. In his time since 2010, this decade, 4 10-win seasons in the past 9 seasons. But that's not even including 3 8-win seasons and 1 9-win season. So basically, he's always around that 8, 9, 10, or 10-plus wins in a season number. There was kind of that one losing season. I think it was back in 2016. That was just uncharacteristic. You're going to get that at every program, basically, except for Alabama, where you just had that kind of slip-up year where, things just didn't fall your way. Some seniors maybe have transferred, things like that. So he's really transformed this program. I mean, he took it to a national title game in 2012. If you look at recruiting, 7 top 15 recruiting finishes since 2011. I'm getting this from ESPN.com. That includes 2 at 16. Currently for this class, they're at number 9. So you look at all these indicators. I mean, even NFL draft picks, they've had several dozen. I think the numbers were in the low 40s since 2010 selected in the NFL draft. So you look at the numbers, and Notre Dame is back. Notre Dame is back as a top program in college football. They're considerably back and doing well and at the top of the game. However, this success really, in terms of results and in the level that Notre Dame expects, hasn't resulted in as much as I guess people would expect if they just heard those numbers. I mean, that 2012 championship title game appearance, that's more of a bad. I think it's looked back on as more of a bad thing than a good, with that 42-14 blowout against Alabama. And watching that game, it really wasn't even that close. If you look at when they made the college football playoff once in its 5 seasons, last year where they lost in the semifinal to Clemson, 30-3. Another just absolute drubbing by a big Power 5 team on the national stage playing for a national title. Then, even off all those wins during the regular season, take a look at their bowl record. The bowl wins under Brian Kelly: Sun Bowl, Pinstripe Bowl, Music City Bowl, and Citrus Bowl. Those are the bowl games they've won. There's no Orange Bowl, there's no Fiesta Bowl even, or national title, or college football playoff semifinal. There's none of that. There's just when they get to those big bowls, they lose them. Simple as that. Right now, they're stuck in this thing where the only bowl games they're getting wins at are the Sun Bowl and the Music City Bowl, ones that, objectively aren't as important as those other New Year's 6 times of games. And this was a really big stat. I kind of went and researched this one this morning. I looked at the last time that they beat a top 10 team on the road under Brian Kelly, because they're going at number 3 Georgia. That's a really tough place to play, and that's beating a top 10 on the road is something insanely tough. But when you want to consider yourself against Alabama, Clemson, Georgia, LSU, these giant programs, the best of the best, you've got to get top 10 wins on the road. And I went back and I looked. Under Brian Kelly, the last time they won at a top 10 team was in 2012, where they actually won at 2 top 10 teams. That was their undefeated season. They won at Oklahoma when the Sooners were number 8, and they went at Michigan State where the Spartans were number 10. They won both of those games. Those are the only 2 times Kelly has won at a top 10 team. Every other time he's gone at a top 10 team, he has lost. They're not getting the road wins against these big teams. And while many other teams might be able to overcome that, the problem with Notre Dame is, in this college football playoff era, conference championships matter more than ever. That's why the Big 12 added one, because back a couple years ago when TCU just kind of got arguably screwed out of a college football playoff spot, it was because there wasn't a conference championship. Conference championships matter more than ever in college football. And Notre Dame being an independent, they can't get them. They have to rely on the regular season. And now, yeah, they do have big games in that regular season. I mean, this season, USC and Stanford aren't too big of games, but, they're usually really, really good programs. Michigan, as always, they'll go out, they'll get a game like Georgia right now against Virginia. They'll play teams like Michigan State. So they have a good non-conference, or I guess you wouldn't call it non-conference, just regular season schedule, even as an independent, because it's Notre Dame. They have these traditional rivalries. But what that means is, since you're not in a conference, you need to win at these top 10 teams, and they're not getting it done. So as we're winding down this decade, as we're winding down the decade of Brian Kelly, the 2010s, this is the last, starting next year, it'll be 2020, this being 2019, this game, I think, means more than a lot of people are giving it credit for. Because if you ask people, how do you remember this Notre Dame decade with Brian Kelly? I think the overwhelming majority would say, he turned the program around and he took it to a next level. But they're really not at the top tier. They're close to it, but they're not there quite yet. And the reason you would say that is that 42-14 loss to Alabama in 2012, that 30-3 loss to Clemson last year. That even though Notre Dame is recruiting towards the top of the country, even though they're producing NFL prospects like a lot of other big Power 5 schools, even though they're having 8, 9, 10-win seasons, they're not beating their presumed competition, these giant Power 5 schools. They're not going at a top 10 team and winning that game. They're not going at Georgia and they're not winning those games. They're not playing Alabama or Clemson in the college football playoff and winning that. They're simply outmatched. And I think that that's what people view Notre Dame as right now, is this program that is just being consistently overrated as a program. Because, yeah, they're number 7 right now in the country, but even at number 7, they're going at number 3. So, they're going to be an underdog. But the line's at 2 touchdowns. And I've seen analysts, and I'm thinking about that line, and I'm actually kind of wondering why it isn't higher. I look at how these two teams match up. I look at the offensive firepower that Georgia has with Jake Fromm and that rushing attack with all of those guys. And I'm wondering, how is the Notre Dame defense going to stop it? I know Notre Dame put up a ton of points against, New Mexico and Mexico State last week. But Ian Book does not look like a quarterback that can go at Georgia and get a win, or at a Power 5 school and get a win. So even though they're number 7, being a 2-touchdown underdog, it's not looking good for this Notre Dame team. It's looking like this Notre Dame decade is going to be remembered as they got back on the national conversation, but they really were never taken seriously in that conversation. And for good reason, because the results just didn't back it up. So if Notre Dame wants to change that, if there is an opportunity for them to rewrite that kind of history, it comes down to this Georgia game. It comes down to how well they're faced against these Bulldogs in Athens. Because if they can't get this win, and if they get blown out, by what this line projects, I think it's at 14.5 the last time I saw it, that would be another time that Notre Dame not only lost against a top 10, top 5 team on a big national stage, but got absolutely demolished. They're not playing these teams close. Besides that 20-19 win over Georgia, and at that point Georgia was only ranked 15th, besides that game, a lot of times they get to these big moments and they're not producing. And not only are they not producing, but they're getting blown out. 42-14, 30-3. If this game's 2 touchdowns, another example. So for Notre Dame and Brian Kelly, this game will go a long way in defining this decade. Will they have this decade of just getting back to the national conversation but never really breaking through? Or will this decade be remembered as they got back into that national conversation, and by the end of it, they were legitimately competing for a national championship? As of right now, though, if I had to make a prediction, I'm not seeing that being the case. And that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Jackson Neill Sports Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Remember, make sure to subscribe, rate this podcast on your favorite platforms. That way you can stay up to date and get the new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Also, make sure to go to jacksonneilepodcasts.com. Link to that down in the show notes. There you'll find episodes for this, as well as episodes to my other podcasts, Anything Goes with Jackson Neill, my interview series, as well as my music discussion podcast. Anything Goes comes out on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the music podcast on Sundays. Now, if you're a really big fan of the show, maybe consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. On there, for just a couple of dollars a month, or actually $1 a month even for the sports podcast, you get access to bonus content, including segments from here on the sports podcast and my music podcast, as well as bonus questions I asked in my interviews on Anything Goes. I write, record, produce, do everything for these podcasts myself as a full-time college student, so any little bit of support really goes a long way and allows me to spend more time making these podcasts. So I'll link to that down in the show notes. Also, my Twitter and Instagram, @JacksonNeill20, post about all of the podcasts and everything I'm doing on there, so give me a follow if you want to keep up to date with all that info. Today's music was by Analog by Nature with their song CDK Sunday. That's it. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you all next time.